when to advance. That's fine.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, why don't we just get started? Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar on carbon pricing in RTO markets. This webinar is sponsored by the Harvard Environmental Policy Initiative, Duke's Nicholas Institute, and the University of North Carolina's Center for Climate, Energy, and Environment and Economics. These three institutions have facilitated the Power Shift Network, which aims to connect expert communities, energy and environmental law scholars, utility regulators, technical analysts, and policymakers around a legal vision for tomorrow's electricity grid. The impetus for this webinar was our recent Power Shift meeting in Nashville. There was a lot of interest among participants in this topic, and we had to cut the discussion short, unfortunately, at that meeting. And in addition, as we'll hear from our first speaker, Judy Chang, this topic is particularly timely because New England wholesale electricity market participants are discussing carbon pricing in a stakeholder process. Let me just introduce our three speakers, and then I'll turn the presentation over to them. And if everybody again could just mute your phones during the presentation. Our first speaker will be Judy Chang. Judy is a principal at the Brattle Group. She's an economist with a public policy background who advises clients on the financial and regulatory issues relating to renewable energy investment and procurement decisions. Steve Weissman founded the Energy Law program at Berkeley and is currently at the Goldman School for Public Policy. Steve is a pioneer on the issue we're going to be talking about today, shortly after it became clear that Congress was not going to pass climate legislation. Steve and a Berkeley colleague authored a series of papers called Addressing Climate Change Without Legislation, and that included a paper about FERC's authority to do so. And our last speaker will be Joel Eisen. Joel is a professor at the University of Richmond School of Law. Joel's recent article entitled FERC's Expansive Authority to Transform the Electric Grid provides a comprehensive history of FERC's affecting jurisdiction and looks at FERC's jurisdiction generally in the wake of the EPSA decision. And his article also includes a look at the Commission's authority to approve a carbon adder. Following our speakers' presentations, we'll open the floor for questions and comments. If you'd like to speak, I think the easiest thing to do would be to just put your name in the chat box so that I can see it, and then I'll call on people once our speakers have concluded. And again, please keep your phone on mute in the meantime. And now I will turn the presentation over to Judy.
Thank you very much. This is Judy Chang. I'm going to set the stage for the discussion today. I'm an energy economist, so I'm coming to the, sorry, there was some noise. I wasn't sure if somebody wanted to speak. If I'm coming to this from an economist perspective, and I've been asked to set the stage and give you some general ideas about how a carbon price in the electricity market would affect the market. To begin, slide one, the reason we're talking about this, and it sounds like there were prior discussions already, but in the most immediate stage is that several states have set goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, really across the economy. However, the power sector has been a focus for many different jurisdictions, primarily because one of the ways to reach a significant carbon reduction in the future is to first reduce the emissions from the power sector and then possibly move transportation and heating sectors onto the power sector so that economy-wide there's a trajectory of carbon emission reduction. To achieve the emissions reduction, there are several things that need to happen in the power sector. And I would argue that all of that work needs to start now for three primary reasons. One is that investments made today, primarily the generation and transmission infrastructure that would need to be made today, will have an operating life of over 30 years. And it takes 5 to 10 years to make those investments, from planning to making the investment to construction. Second, existing systems and power markets were really not set up in the past to internalize the cost of these emissions. So this is a significant transformation, even if the mechanics and the logistics would not be challenging, which it is, but even if it were not challenging, it's difficult to transform the existing power markets and system to internalize some of these costs. And like I said, thirdly, the economy-wide emissions reduction really need to lean on the power sector. So we need to essentially decarbonize the power sector first and then transition the other sectors to rely on the electricity system more. Next slide, please. So the question is, how do we get there? The first, slide 2 here, I'm just going to set the stage again to just explain, as many of you know, there are already many different mechanisms out there to put a price of CO2 emissions onto the power sector. There's primarily 3 types of approach. One is a cap and trade. That means you cap the emissions by policy. So you set the target of the emissions by year, and then allow parties to trade so that the most efficient abatement approaches would be used to reduce the emissions and comply with the cap. Second is some kind of a carbon price, or placing a price on carbon emissions, or in some jurisdictions like tax. That means instead of setting a target of the emission quantity, you're putting a target on the price. And that usually requires an estimation of what price would be reasonable to achieve the emissions reduction targeted by policymakers. And then third, there's a rate-based standard approach, which the Clean Power Plan is hinged on, but there are also other jurisdictions that have used rate-based approach, which is essentially setting a cap on the emissions rate as opposed to the total emissions. This slide 2, gives you a brief description of each of the 3 approaches or mechanisms. It also talks a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages. I'll just highlight a few things. Cap and trade, the most obvious advantage is that you're targeting an emissions quantity, which means it'll place more certainty on the emissions reduction achieved. However, investors, some investors may not like this because there might be some, actually history has told us there could be quite a bit of uncertainty around the price resulting from the cap and trade. Now, the flip side is putting a target price, and that would give the price certainty. On the other hand, the actual emissions reduction or the emissions quantity will face some uncertainties. And then the third approach, rate-based. Some believe that rate-based standards are good because in some jurisdictions there's a growth potential in both economic growth, but also in this particular case, power sector growth. And a rate-based approach basically says that as long as the emissions rate does not increase or achieves reduction, then it could help facilitate the growth in the economy in that jurisdiction. On the other hand, the actual emissions quantity could be under quite a bit of uncertainty because as growth factors are uncertain, so would be emissions. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the things that we need to think about when we talk about CO2 pricing in the wholesale electricity market? On this slide 3, we basically talk about a few factors that need to be considered. So the concept includes a carbon price. Whether that price is set by a cap and trade, that means, for example, in the RGGI states in New England and New York, these are outside the wholesale electricity market mechanism to cap the emissions and allow parties to trade, and the price or the cost of carbon emissions is set by that market. Another way to have a carbon price is, of course, to have a regional market estimate a price trajectory that might be useful to comply with the regional policies. And then thirdly, there's an obvious one, which is either a government or a third party stakeholder group that sets a price administratively. Usually you want the price to be set in a way that ties back to the emissions targets or emissions reduction targets. And then once there is a price on carbon, generators in the power sector would add a carbon cost to their generation bid into the market. This means, it'll show on the next slide, but essentially, just like other variable costs, which are costs per unit of production, the carbon cost would be an additional cost adder per unit of production. The generators are then in turn charged that carbon cost or carbon price for the emissions. So the higher emitting resources will pay a higher carbon cost per unit of power produced, and the lower emitting one will pay less for carbon costs per unit of power produced. The dispatch will be very similar as it is today with a new parameter to optimize. So today, the power sector optimizes the dispatch based on variable costs and in subject to meeting the reliability of the system. In the future, if there is a carbon cost associated with the variable cost in the bid adder, then the dispatch would be similarly minimizing the total cost, including the environmental attributes or the emissions cost, while meeting reliability of the system. The resulting power prices will be higher because, as you expect, some generators will be, I'm talking about the short-term effect. The short-term effect is the power prices will be higher compared to a system where the generators did not have a carbon cost before. Now, the higher power prices will be paid by consumers, reflecting the additional emissions constraints. While it's, different jurisdictions are discussing how to do this, but the collected revenues from the carbon cost could be used for a variety of ways, including returning some of that cost or all of those costs collected to electricity consumers because they ultimately paid a higher price for electricity. Next slide, please. So on slide 4, this is a simplified example. Both slide 4 and slide 5 will give you a very simplified example of how this would work in the market. What you see on the right-hand chart is what we call a supply stack of the generators. These are the variable costs. The y-axis shows you the variable cost of each type of generator, which are reflected as prices in the market. So where the red horizontal line hits the demand, which is the vertical in the simple example, the vertical load, that would be the price set into the wholesale electricity market. So in this top example, without a carbon price, the clearing price could be for electricity or energy could be $45. And you can see that we just circled coal as what we call inframarginal resource, which is a resource that's below the clearing price, and that coal plant will generate. In reality, it's much more complex than this. The bid has many components, including constraints on how they can move up and down, how quickly they can ramp, and what's a fixed cost versus variable cost, but this is just a simplified example. Now, the bottom graph is exactly the same bid, except now they're adding a cost of carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. The light gray part of the bar shows you now each of the generators is now adding a separate cost of CO2, and you can see the shift in the coal generator from left of the vertical load bar to the right, signifying or showing or illustrating that the coal plant would pay a higher cost of emissions per unit of production. And in this case, the load hasn't changed in this simplified example, but the clearing price has increased and the marginal resource has shifted from the previous gas combined cycle to a gas combustion turbine with a clearing price of $85 as opposed to the $45, including the carbon cost. Now, this is what we call short-term effect. This means this is how the generation dispatch would be done in the marketplace. And it's short term because it's really just the minute by minute or hour by hour shift in what if you just shock the market with a $50 per ton CO2 price, what would happen to the dispatch? Now, there's obviously a longer term effect if the market actually sustains a carbon price as reflected in slide 4. So let's move on to slide 5. Slide 5 just shows you, okay, so what does this mean on a long-term basis? What this means is that since power prices in the previous slide is higher, the lower emitting resources will essentially collect more revenues than they would have had in the past without a CO2 price. So the right-hand bar again, right-hand graphs again show you the longer term effect where in the prior example without a CO2 price, they may earn a smaller amount, whereas in the lower parts of the graphics, you can see the nuclear power plants actually earning more because the longer term power prices are higher and they do not incur a carbon cost associated with producing nuclear power. This would be true for the wind and hydro in the bottom part of the graphic as well. You can see the wind in the prior, on the top, received a $45 energy price, but on the lower part of the chart, they would receive a $59 energy price, and therefore creates more incentive for zero or low emitting resources to come into the market. Okay, I think I've covered all the words on the slide. I didn't read them, but I think that's the effects I've discussed. Now, there are quite a few complications, just to name a few on slide 6. One is, I alluded to this before, carbon price certainty and sustainability. This means that, it's for low emitting resources, it's great to have a market price for electricity that's higher, induced by a carbon price, all else equal, induced by a carbon price. Now, this effect, so remembering what the whole goal was, right? The whole goal was to make sure that we clean up the power sector. But to clean up the power sector, we would need low emitting or zero emitting resources to come into the market. That's why the previous slide talked about the long-term effect. But for the long-term effect to actually take place, investors will have to actually be able to bank on the power prices being higher due to the carbon price. And not only higher for blips of days or even a year or two, but actually be able to bank on the prices being high enough to pay for the total cost of the clean energy resource. So that's an uncertainty that investors are not willing to take if they think, oh, well, carbon prices seem to be high for the next 2 years, but after that, perhaps the carbon price market would tank, and therefore I'm not willing to make an investment in a clean energy resource if I cannot take that to the bank. If a bank is not willing to finance my project because there's significant uncertainty on the size of the carbon price over the longer term. So that does become complicated. Those that design carbon markets will say, well, and there are lots of experience in this already, is we can design a carbon market that provides more certainty. Generally, that means there are mechanisms to limit how low the prices can go and how high the prices can go. Okay, just a bit more on this, just to take that a little bit further or a little bit closer to home, New England, the carbon prices would have to be high enough and long enough to attract clean energy resources. And if they don't, then the volatile, you might end up in a situation where prices are high, but not high enough or not high for long enough to have the actual results that you want. But then if the prices are high, policymakers and politicians have a hard time because ultimately consumers are paying for a higher cost of power if the carbon prices are high. So then the next point is, well, what can you do to mitigate some of these cost impacts on consumers? one of the approaches, and there are many approaches and some have been tested already, one of the approaches is to be able to offset the price impact on consumers by either basically sending them a rebate of those costs or prices or cost collected, or take that carbon cost collected and invest, or somehow find a way to invest in clean energy that you originally wanted to bring into the market in the first place. Okay, I did not create a slide for the New England activities. I'll just spend a minute or so on that. So New England is in the situation where several states have legislation that set out long-term contracts or ability to engage into long-term contracts for clean energy resources to participate or to, participate in the wholesale market. But once one decides, as the states have, that a significant amount of resources needs to come in through long-term contracts, what that means is those resources that are coming in the market might not be exposed to the market prices. And if that's the case, eventually the market will lose its ability to affect and create incentives. So what New England states have decided to do is a stakeholder process through what they call the NEPL stakeholder process to think through what approaches the market design team can adopt so that in some ways the region can get ahead of long-term contracts. Because what the chicken and egg problem here is policymakers might look at the market and say, look, the market doesn't bring the resources we need to meet the public policy requirements in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and the other states that have targets of 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, basically saying, looking at the market, say, well, the market is not bringing us all the resources we need to meet those emissions reductions, so we must do something. And to do something, we are creating long-term contracts to bring in resources. But by doing so, you're actually creating even less incentives of using the markets for future investments. So the stakeholders in New England are getting together and talking through, well, how do we get in front of this game or ahead of this game so that we can design a market that's sustainable and meets the public policy needs of the region. So essentially that's what the IMAP process is going on in the NEPL in New England. I'm going to pause there and hand the baton over.
All right, thank you, Judy. And with that, we'll turn over to Steve.
Okay, thank you, Judy, for that great introduction to the issues. The story began for us, meaning the UC Berkeley Law School Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, back in early 2013, when then Congressman Henry Waxman, who was the former chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, asked us to look into tools available to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and existing law to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The work that I did in conjunction with Romney Webb, who I believe is also on this webinar. And Romney, I encourage you to join in whenever you have something you'd like to add. We prepared a report that was issued only after the confirmation of Commissioner Bay, who ultimately was destined to be the chair and is the current chair. Congressman Waxman was very intrigued by the report that we issued, and the marquee proposal or suggestion was that FERC could introduce a carbon adder on wholesale price of power. He then chose to hold a subcommittee hearing. He invited all the FERC commissioners to attend. He admonished them to read our recommendations. He placed them in the congressional record. And then he met individually with the commissioners. And as I understand, when he met with Commissioner Bay, went over the specific suggestions that we had in detail. So this occurred in 2014. And so this has been a concept that has been before the current FERC commissioners at least that long. It's certainly not something that they have done anything to act upon up until now. The premise underlying our suggestion comes from FERC's authority to ensure that rates are just and reasonable. And this is a concept that's been tested in different ways. Probably the dominant case in this area was the U.S. Supreme Court decision issued in 1972 in the case of NAACP versus the Federal Power Commission, which is a predecessor for FERC. And the concept there was the NAACP had asked FERC to act to reduce discriminatory hiring practices among utilities. FERC said that it had no jurisdiction to do this, and the case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, which ultimately agreed with the fundamental concept that FERC's authority did not extend to directly policing the hiring practices for utilities. On the other hand, the court emphasized that FERC does have an interest in activities such as discriminatory hiring, as it may have an impact on rates and costs and rates, and that FERC should have an interest in mitigating potential unreasonable cost generators or subsequently disallowing costs related to things such as lawsuits related to discriminatory hiring practices. The concept, as we suggested it in our report, had to do with FERC's evolution from setting just and reasonable rates based on cost of service to its increasing emphasis on wholesale markets and its adoption of the premise that as long as wholesale markets are robust, and if participants don't exercise market power or otherwise take advantage of market failures, that FERC could rely on the prices set in those wholesale markets as being just and reasonable. The argument here is that as long as carbon-emitting generators are able to mask the true cost of their providing service by not having to face those externalities, as long as they can do that, arguably rates are not truly just and reasonable, because those generators take an unfair competitive advantage in the marketplace, and that eventually, if there were a reasonable price on carbon, that the market would adjust to the point where generation would be provided in the most efficient way for society as a whole, reflecting all the costs to society, not only those that are directly absorbed by the generator in providing the service. There are a couple of examples of situations in which FERC has recognized what it has seen from a public policy perspective as being an insufficiency or inadequacy in the way that rates are created, and has stepped in to in effect take steps that increase rates in order to meet a broader objective. The first example, and we provide both these examples in the report that we issued. The first example had to do with PJM and its pricing for transmission as it reflected the cost of line losses. And FERC concluded that it was appropriate to impose marginal cost for line losses on all transmission users, regardless of the actual line losses occurring at any particular time of day or under certain congestion conditions. And this was in order to provide an incentive for generators to be located at points closer to load, and also to just make the overall generation more efficient. By imposing a marginal cost on line losses, FERC knew that it was going to be generating more revenue than would be reflected by out-of-pocket costs. And in response to that, they set up a mechanism where the excess revenues would be redistributed to those who pay fixed costs on the transmission system in a proportional way. So the redistribution was independent of actual purchases on any particular day, but was designed to be an equitable approach to make sure that this change in pricing did not have an unnecessary effect in terms of increasing customer costs. This mechanism, including the redistribution mechanism, was the subject of a Court of Appeals case, and the Court of Appeals did confirm FERC's authority to use this particular approach. The other concept has to do with the forward capacity markets in New England and in PJM, and an effort to make sure that purchasers of capacity in the capacity markets that also happen to own or control a capacity not be able to price the capacity that they would introduce into the forward capacity markets in a manner that did not fully reflect costs. The concern was that this would be an exercise, in effect, of market power on the behalf of purchasers, and that by doing this, they might stimulate market clearing price that would, in effect, benefit their own purchases of capacity, and do that in a way that might understimulate the development of new capacity where it would be needed by having an overall clearing price that would be lower than would occur otherwise. And this has been, as I say, this requirement of having a minimum price, which would have a tendency over the course of time to push the market clearing price up, has been adopted in a couple of instances. And so here we have two examples: the line losses and the capacity markets of situations where FERC recognized what it saw as being a need to take steps to increase market prices in a way that it felt would benefit the development of long-term development of healthy markets. And the same concept arguably would apply here, and we could get into this in more detail if you want to in questions and answers. We've started to vet these issues with this group and with others, and have identified, in addition to those that were suggested by Judy, a number of different challenging and important questions that would have to be addressed in order to effectively adopt this type of approach. So it's not an easy or challenge-free way to go, but to first adopt the concept, to understand that this is the direction where people want to go, and then work on the details seems to be the way to go. So I want to, at this point, step back and give Joel an opportunity to talk about how the conversation has evolved since then, and we'll be happy to talk about other issues later.
All right. Before we turn it over to Joel, I just wanted to remind everyone, including those who are on cell phones, to please mute your line. And if you have questions for following Joel's presentation, please just use the chat function and let me know that you have a question, and I'll call on you. And if realize that disadvantages people over the phone, so you can send me an email, apescoe, A-P-E-S-K-O-E, @law.harvard.edu. And with that, I will turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Ari, and thanks, Steve and Judy, for the terrific introductions here. The work that I'm talking about today also originated about 3 years ago, and it was as a result of tracking the litigation that became FERC versus EPSA in the Supreme Court, and talking about the practices affecting rates jurisdiction, as Ari mentioned earlier, that FERC has under the Federal Power Act. And in the work that I did that was published in a law review article, I'm happy to provide a link to that article offline if anybody would like. I explored the practices affecting rates jurisdiction that FERC has as it was developed in FERC versus EPSA, and then how it would apply to a hypothetical carbon adder in a wholesale electricity market. And the analysis here goes back about 100 years to the Interstate Commerce Act, the forerunner of the Federal Power Act. The language in Federal Power Act, Section 206, that gives FERC the power to remedy a rule, regulation, practice, or contract affecting such rate that is unjust, unreasonable, unduly discriminatory, or preferential. And for convenience from this point on, I'll refer to that as the practice affecting rates jurisdiction. That language was carried over wholesale from the Interstate Commerce Act, which originally applied to the railroads. And what has happened over the years, and Steve did a good job of mentioning this in his own presentation, is that as FERC's, as the bulk of FERC's work has shifted from regulating individual rulemakings to administering and to overseeing the wholesale markets, the concept of what discrimination is, the concept of what is unjust and unreasonable in the markets has shifted. But now, after FERC versus EPSA, so has the idea of what it means to be a practice affecting rates. And so I want to talk about both of them because the evolution there has really been very much in parallel over the years. And the limitations that FERC versus EPSA imposes on a practice affecting rates, notably that it be one directly affecting wholesale rates, is one which I've explored at length in the article and developed a number of criteria to apply both to demand response and to carbon pricing. And again, you'll see a fair amount of overlap here between what Steve was just saying, particularly in the theoretical underpinnings that give FERC authority to remedy a situation where it sees that there is an unfair competitive advantage to one set of generators or another. Originally, the idea of discrimination, way back in Teddy Roosevelt's time, meant discrimination by individual firms preferring one set of customers over another and so forth. It shifted, and now in the markets, as Steve implied, an unfair advantage to an individual participant in the markets or to a group of participants in the markets in the conduct of those markets. And so that's a shift that's happened over time, and it's been confirmed numerous times by the courts. And again, if you look at the historical evolution of this and map it onto the various points in time that Steve and I talk about, you'll see that discrimination has evolved into discrimination in the markets, in the operation of the markets itself. The case that most of you, the rule that most of you are familiar with is Order 888's citing of discrimination in access to transmission in setting the remedy of opening up the transmission lines. Practices originally was the practices of an individual firm. And later, when FERC did business through tariffs, the practices were those practices that were listed in tariffs. And now, after FERC versus EPSA, my analysis shows, practices means something quite entirely different. What it means is those practices, not necessarily of an individual firm, but the actions or practices that have a direct and substantial impact on the wholesale markets. Okay, and so here the analysis begins by suggesting that the failure to include the cost of carbon in the pricing of the wholesale electricity markets is a practice. Now, that sounds like something that's in action, but in the case of demand response, it was the failure to compensate demand response at the market price that led to Order 745 and then to FERC versus EPSA. So the failure to compensate, the failure to impose a social cost of carbon in the markets is what would be the justification for a carbon price under practice affecting rates. It requires a threshold finding that rates are unjust, unreasonable, or unduly discriminatory. The predicate there would be the same predicate that Steve mentioned and that Judy mentioned, that there is an unfair competitive advantage to non-zero carbon resources from having others be able to bid in without accounting for their environmental externalities. The tricky question after FERC versus EPSA is whether this is a practice that is directly affecting rates. And what my analysis has found is that there are several different factors that lead to a conclusion that FERC has authority under the practices affecting authority. One of them is, and these are not hard and fast guidelines, but again, they're essentially means of deciding an individual situation. The first one is that we are talking about direct market participants. This is important because a practice, as both the DC Circuit and Supreme Court noticed, could be just about anything that had an impact on the wholesale markets. But the limitation in the capacity market cases that Steve mentioned, in other cases that are precedential here, suggests that FERC has to be acting to govern the actions of direct market participants and not, say, those whose actions might have an impact on wholesale market rates, but don't take part in the wholesale markets. I use an example with my students of the shoe manufacturing firm that wants to locate in ISO New England's footprint and would be a big taker of electricity from the regional grid, but FERC can't interfere to decide whether or not that firm gets a business license from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the basis that its location at that site would directly affect rates, and the rationale there is it's direct participants who are regulated. The analogy there is something on the order of the stock exchange. Stock exchange participants are directly federally regulated, but I and Steve and Ari are not regulated so directly by the SEC in what we do in our capacity as individual investors. The second factor here is that FERC is acting to deal with overall system adequacy. Some people have called this reliability. I prefer not to use the word reliability because it brings up implications that are relatively narrow, that is meeting supply and demand. But what we mean is the overall health and adequacy of the system over the long term. And here, FERC is within its power to regulate when it is looking at the system as a whole, as Steve and I have both mentioned, and regulating on that basis. And this, I think, is a very important limitation of practices affecting rates. That is, Order 745 affected an entire industry sector and not one individual firm. It's almost the flip side, if you will, of the way practices and discrimination were viewed in the 1900s. But because we have wholesale markets in place, that this is, I think, a very important limitation of the authority. The third, and frankly the most significant one here, is what the Supreme Court mentioned in FERC versus EPSA. FERC has authority over, and I'm quoting here from the case, Those methods or ways of doing things on the part of the utility that directly affect the rate or are closely related to the rate, not remote things beyond the rate structure that might in some sense indirectly or ultimately might do so. The DC Circuit was concerned about FERC regulating the steel and labor markets on the basis that it would have an impact. It would have an impact on the wholesale markets. This limitation is not made up wholly from new cloth. In fact, it goes back all the way to the original concept of discrimination that was embodied in the Interstate Commerce Act. And the cases that involved tariffs in the 1970s and 80s, even though they involved a very different context from today's wholesale markets, contain this limitation that there is a direct economic impact on the wholesale markets from the practice in question. And we could think of that as having two different parts. The first one is that it is an economic impact. The second is that it has significant impacts on rates. This comes from a case involving the California ISO that then Judge Scalia decided in the DC Circuit in the 1980s. The directness idea, I want to be very careful and deliberate about this, is not necessarily required to have immediate proximate causation. The DC Circuit in the Order 1000 decision held that transmission planning at the regional level was a practice affecting rates. And that is obviously not something that leads to an immediate construction of a transmission line. There are numerous intermediate steps at both the federal and the state level. But the fact that the planning that is engaged in at the regions can have impacts on the construction of transmission lines and therefore on wholesale rates is something that the DC Circuit found was squarely within FERC's jurisdiction. So see, three different factors here. Participation by, regulating the participation of direct market participants in their conduct. The second one, FERC is regulating overall system adequacy. The third one is that the practice in question has direct and significant impact on wholesale rates. Each one of those in turn with the carbon adder, I think is satisfied. The first one is obvious, that we are talking, if you look at the energy price, any energy market price design that Judy put forth, it is an added amount that applies to generators who bid into the market. So it directly affects market participants. The second one, system adequacy, I think is satisfied, but only if you view system adequacy as having a regional mix of resources that includes all of the resources that Judy has on her slide there. And this is a recognition that wind and other renewable resources bring various attributes to long-term reliability of the grid, such as avoiding the need to build new natural gas pipelines in ISO New England, for example, that puts this squarely within FERC's jurisdiction. The third one, direct and significant impact, I think is unarguable as the imposition of a $50 carbon price, just to use Judy's number, would directly and immediately impact wholesale rates without any steps in between. This analysis doesn't require that the carbon price be set at any one particular amount. When I've been asked about this in discussions over the last couple of weeks, people have said, well, you know, what price is the outcome of this? And that we're talking about FERC's jurisdiction here and not about the particular level of a carbon price that would be sorted out in the ways that Judy describes and eventually adopted by the commission. And I want to just say here that the carbon price proposal could arise in any of a number of different ways. The most likely one, and the one that I've analyzed in the paper, is that a regional process like the one Judy describes leads to a region adoption of a carbon price proposal that is then presented to FERC in a 205 filing. It could arise in another way. It could arise by stakeholders bringing a complaint under Section 206, but there they bear a higher burden of proof to show that the rates in a region are unjust and unreasonable or unduly discriminatory. One question that has also been asked here is whether FERC could impose this unilaterally or impose it on a national basis. To the first one, I think that if the analysis that Steve develops and the one that I develop here suggests that FERC has the authority to impose a carbon price, that in theory, it could in fact do so. The problem is, for me, at least with respect to my analysis, that system adequacy is likely to differ from regional grid to regional grid, and that it would require some broad findings along the lines of those that the Commission used in Order 745, and would be somewhat less defensible under this theory. I think it would be much better for the stakeholders in a region organically to come up with a proposal of their own and to bring it forth as a Section 205 filing. Second question that arises quite often is whether the filing and approval of a carbon price proposal in one region would be precedential as to the others. And here again, I believe that because specific findings are required in any individual region, the answer is probably no. And I think that the challenging case in that regard is that if stakeholders in another region brought a 206 complaint after a price proposal was successfully approved under Section 205, that might be a very intriguing. But that again, that's a subject that we can talk about some more in the discussion. With that, let me leave it there. There's obviously plenty to talk about for all of us, and I welcome your questions.
Great, thank you, Joel, Steve, and Judy. As I said, if you have a question, let me know in the chat feature, and I can either read your question or just call on you, and you can give it a shot. Let me start out with one. And Joel, this is particularly for you and Steve, and I know that, Joel, your whole presentation kind of gets at this idea, but I wondered if you could address directly the issue of, EPA is the environmental regulator, FERC is the market regulator. Is FERC overstepping its bounds here and becoming an environmental regulator, and how do you address that issue head on?
I think, thanks for that question, and not surprisingly, that's a question that all of us will be called upon to answer as proposals of this sort move forward. The FERC has authority over the wholesale markets and their operation. And in fact, the courts have confirmed that when FERC acts to oversee what's going on in the wholesale markets, to think back to the two cases that Steve mentioned, that deference to what FERC does is at its zenith. It is not only deference, but it is a higher level of deference, and that's what led me to base my second guideline on system adequacy. That having been said, I've been asked directly, could FERC approve a price proposal from a region A if it said it was doing so to satisfy the environmental requirements brought upon it by the states? So Massachusetts is, in ISO New England, for example, Massachusetts is 80% greenhouse gas reduction goals, or the RPSs of the different states. And I said no, because there would have to be findings that it was essential to the operation of the wholesale markets to do this and not simply an environmental finding. I think the flip side of this question is that a failure to account for carbon emissions in the wholesale markets, as all three of us have described, is something that FERC can address within its authority. And it's true that that has environmental impacts, but I think we all believe that FERC has the authority to act in this situation. The EPA obviously has authority under other federal statutes, notably the Clean Air Act and acting with the Clean Power Plan, but FERC has the authority here, notwithstanding the fact that it has environmental impacts. I would say that if FERC simply grounded its action in a finding that it was environmentally impermissible to do this in the wholesale markets, then that runs afoul of the methodology that I have in mind.
Yeah, I'll just concur with everything that Joel's just said, and again, harken back to the NAACP case, where I think the court laid out that distinction very clearly. If the then Federal Power Commission had taken actions to disallow costs on the basis of a utility having undertaken discriminatory hiring practices, arguably that disallowance would have an effect on future behavior related to employment at the utility. So you could make the same argument there and say, well, the FERC might be overstepping its bounds by doing that because it's not the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. And but the court, I think, fairly clearly said that the interest for the Federal Power Commission start and stop with factors that affect just and reasonable rates. And since it would be unreasonable, arguably, to pass on unlawful costs, that FERC was justified in taking the actions it did. Same thing here. If there is an environmental effect from what's happening here, that doesn't negate the jurisdiction FERC would have to protect just and reasonable rates.
Thank you. Let me turn it to David Bono with the Conservation Law Foundation, who has a question.
I think his audio is not on.
Oh, David, I think you're on mute. I think you have to unmute yourself.
There, is that better?
Yeah, you're better. You're on.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And Ari, thanks for including me in the webinar. I've been lucky enough to work with Judy on these issues regarding the ISO New England. And as Ari knows, I really appreciate the work Steve and Joel have done in their writings. It's been very helpful to thinking through the issues. I just had a question about federalism. I don't know, I was just wondering if anybody in this carbon adder context has really been thinking about the subtle federalism issues that the Federal Power Act embeds. It just seems that, you know, states have the jurisdiction over making generation decisions, and they are, in some measure, many states are making a statement that they have a strong preference for a stronger renewable mix than is being generated out of RTOs that are traveling on a full market basis, and saying, you know, that the market ought to determine not just the prices for resources that are adequate to meet needs, but also the mix. You know, there's the affecting jurisdiction that kind of protects federal jurisdiction, and I'm just wondering if there's any thinking going on towards some sort of analogy that might protect the state jurisdiction as the RTOs are, in some measure contemplating measures that counteract the states. I look at PJM and see that sort of thing happening, and I worry about it in other jurisdictions as well.
I'm happy to start with that. Steve, do you want to start with that one?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. I think that's a great question, David, and I think it hits at the core of what everybody is thinking after FERC versus EPSA and Hughes, the two Supreme Court decisions this year. And that truly is how the authority is going, how the jurisdictional lines are going to look between the states and federal government down the line after these two decisions. And what you see notably in FERC versus EPSA is a solicitude for the state's actions, so that states have the authority, as you mentioned, to cite power plants, and that authority is unabated. And so one of the states in the ISO New England footprint could encourage the construction of particular power plants, as long as they didn't subsidize the plants in a way that ran afoul of Hughes. Okay? And so I actually do talk about this at length in the article. The idea is now that we're in a world of what some of us have called concurrent federalism, where the federal government and the state governments are going to be taking actions at the same time that have impacts on one another. And that's something the Supreme Court has implicitly endorsed. It has actually said that FERC can take actions in the wholesale markets, demand response being the example in FERC versus EPSA, notwithstanding the fact that it would have impacts on retail rates. The DC Circuit's decision had been all about protecting state authority. It had been all about saying that demand response wasn't exclusively state activity. The Supreme Court felt otherwise, but also felt compelled to say that we're in this new environment where the federal government and the states are acting effectively at the same time. Okay? And so a state could, I'll just use an example from Hughes, a state could take an action to subsidize a power plant if it didn't base that subsidy on what's going on in the wholesale markets. And so what was impermissible about Maryland's subsidy program was taking wholesale prices as an input and then adding an amount on top of it. Now, what's interesting about the ISO New England discussion about carbon pricing is really that the states in ISO New England are actually driving the discussion at the regional level, rather than the discussion being one that's imposed on the states. And so it seems to me that's a very healthy development, and something that if the proposal is worked out with the states in NEPOOL, it seems to me that that's an excellent example of how the federalism discussion has shifted from one where the federal government operated in its separate sphere and the state governments operated in their separate sphere, to one where it is more an idea of the two acting at the same time. I hope that answers the question.
I think that was a great answer, Joel. I just would probably add on top of that there's really nothing. All this involves an interface between FERC and prices that are established in wholesale markets. Nothing is in federal law is requiring states to furnish all of their power through competitive wholesale markets, and so there still remain choices that states can make beyond that. So I just wanted to add that one factor, and also just acknowledge the fact that on this call we've got a tremendous number of people who've thought critically about these issues, and I certainly welcome hearing from anybody else who's on the webinar who has a thought about this question.
I'm going to turn it to Melissa Powers for the next question. Melissa, are you there?
I think she's muted.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm unmuted, I think. Yeah?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry.
We hear you, Melissa.
Sorry about that. I was on my phone as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit or see what your thoughts are about efforts to create the Western RTO. And first of all, whether you think that a Western RTO could provide a good sort of case study or test ground for really promoting rules that would support more renewable integration, and maybe actually for also providing a good test case for pricing carbon in the wholesale market, perhaps as a condition of FERC approving the creation of a Western RTO.
Maybe, yeah, Steve,
right,
sorry,
please.
I thought maybe you thought.
Go ahead, Melissa.
I was going to say, maybe you should start since you're in the West and maybe have thought about this.
Well, just let me touch on at least part of this. Of course, one of the big challenges in having a West-wide market is that you've got carbon policy in California, but not the same kind of market-based carbon policy in other Western states. And the California Independent System Operators already have to start facing this issue with its energy imbalance market. They developed a mechanism that actually uses the term carbon adder, which allows people to bid into the energy imbalance market, which affects both carbon regulated territories and carbon not regulated territories, in a way that identifies a separate component of the bid to reflect the costs of carbon regulation compliance in California, so that if a non-California entity is interested in purchasing from that source, it could remove that adder or not pay that adder and just pay the plain price for the power itself. So they've been dealing with a mechanism to identify that distinction, and going forward with a broader West-wide market, there's going to be a need to continue to recognize that kind of distinction. And I think that other distinctions related to state-based policies could be incorporated as well. One of the challenges, though, and even considering what's going on with the carbon price in California, that price has an artificial floor and, in effect, an artificial ceiling, because there's a reserve quantity of carbon allowances that the California Air Resources Board releases available at a higher carbon price, so that in fact it's a soft ceiling. The carbon price that's being paid in California for allowances is in the $11 to $13 range, which is extremely far below what EPA at least recognizes as the societal cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And so there would be a real life question there. If there was going to be a carbon price imposed, would it be imposed even on the California markets where there already is a carbon price, but it happens to be significantly below the societal cost for greenhouse gas emissions? So I just want to flag that as an issue that is among those that have to be addressed. And Joel, I'll step back and let you talk.
Yeah, I mean,
Actually, this is Judy. I could add to that.
Go ahead.
If that's okay with you, Joel.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, hearing no objection, I will add. So we just did a recent Western-wide RTO analysis to look at California and its neighbors. I think, Melissa, you're right. Ideally, if there is a new market to be designed, it would be a good test bed to start there. Plus, California already has a carbon price. However, the challenge of what at least California is facing, California ISO is facing, is that to just attract entities to participate in a California or the current ISO driven markets, many of the states, the realities are many of the states do not want California's carbon price to be at all imposed onto other states. So I think the political atmosphere is quite challenging to think of a regional market in the West that would be the first to have a carbon price. And I say that also because in some ways, the reason New England is testing this regional process or actively engaging in discussing this regional carbon price process is because New England, in some ways, all the states have a target, a very similar target. Some are law, some are targets. So in some ways, it's the most likely region to have a regional carbon price setting mechanism. And I think it is probably more challenging for the West. And not to say also, if the West goes to a market, a regional market, there'll be a substantial amount of transition to just get to what the wholesale market would need to look like and operate as other markets have reached. And there's a substantial amount of challenge there. To think that they could also tackle this at the same time, I think will be difficult.
I want to echo something that Judy just said. It's not directly related to the question of the Western RTO, which I think Steve has covered very well, and Judy has weighed in on. The ISO New England process appears to be the one that's moving the most quickly because there appears to be a greater buy-in from the individual states there than elsewhere, and I think that's a real lesson of caution in other RTOs, not just in the West. My impression is that others, there is less unanimity among state participants for the idea of a carbon price, and hence I think the process is going to move a little bit more deliberately than it will in ISO New England. When I first made a presentation 2 weeks about this, I used ISO New England in part because it was moving the most as a case study, because it was moving the most quickly, but also because there truly is a sense out there that it's the one most likely, as Judy said, to lead to some sort of result in the near term, and that other efforts by individual regions might take quite a bit longer.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're about 10 minutes before 2, so just a couple minutes past the time we were scheduled. I want to thank again Judy Chang, Steve Weissman, and Joel Eisen for leading the discussion today. And thank you everyone for joining, and I'm sure our speakers would be happy to follow up with anyone offline and continue the discussion on these issues. Ari,
by way of follow-up, I just sent everybody by chat a link to the article that I was talking about.
Perfect.
For download.
Great. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.